Hello folks, Dick Fairburn here. Continuing in my series of defensive pistol calibers. I mean this is kind of an introductory for people who are getting into concealed carry, and we know that gun sales are up, concealed carry applications are up. We're facing a rather uncertain future in this country and in the world. And I think a lot of people are deciding that they have to put their personal safety in their own hands. I spent more than 40 years in the personal protection business as a police officer, but I can tell you, more and more, when you call for help from the police, especially in major cities, it may be a while before they get there. It may be too late by the time they get there. So, if you're considering concealed carry, I hope this series of caliber information will help you make a choice. And for those of us who have been around the business for a while, it's always kind of interesting to talk over the cartridges and a little history of where they came from and learn from that. So today I'm talking about the 45 ACP. If you want to hear what I have to say about this one, stick around. Okay, on my notes, my kind of script when I put this together, I labeled this the 45 ACP, Automatic Colt Pistol. Is it a legendary man stopper or a FUD myth? If you don't know what a FUD is on YouTube, look it up. That's they compare you to Elmer Fudd in his goofiness at chasing the wascally wabbit. And if the new kids out there, who I sometimes label gun shop commandos, if they think you're old-fashioned, they call you a FUD, and there's really not much more old-fashioned to them than the 45 cartridge or the 1911 pistol it was created for. So here we go. When I started out in law enforcement, the 9mm Luger was kind of a controversial caliber. Most cops carried revolvers in those days. The most prevalent revolver in my neck of the woods was a .357 Magnum. Generally either a Model 19 or a Model 66, the stainless equivalent, from Smith & Wesson. That was just the most common gun in cops' holsters. There were a lot of Illinois cops carrying semi-autos because of the Illinois State Police. Because in 1967, the Illinois State Police was the first major U.S. agency to adopt a semi-auto pistol. They adopted the Smith & Wesson Model 39 in 9mm. They stayed with Smith & Wesson and that caliber for more than 30 years. And if you want to place the blame of moving them away from the 9mm cartridge, I can prove I'm the guy that did it. So, you know, maybe I'm your hero, maybe I'm a FUD, I don't know. So there were a lot of 9mm pistols in police holsters in Illinois, and that, you know, probably 90% plus were revolvers when I started. Now it's 99.9% semi-autos. Seeing a police officer carrying a revolver is, I don't remember the last one I've seen. It's been quite a while. When I turned 18, I could legally own a handgun. I could not legally buy one from an FFL dealer. It's still that case today, although a U.S. Appeals Court just struck that down and said 18-year-olds should be able to buy. But my cop buddy did a kind of a straw purchase at the time, which was very common. He bought an 18-year-old my first pistol, and my first pistol was a Colt 70 series government model chambered for the 45 ACP. So I can literally say I cut my pistol teeth on a 1911. And not long after that, when IPSC was in its infancy under the direction of Jeff Cooper, and into my Army time, when I got out of the Army in '79, I stopped by Gunsight Ranch, moving from California back to Illinois. A buddy of mine, in fact, the buddy who bought me the the Colt was helping me move. We spent a couple of hours with Colonel Cooper and got the information we needed, and we started in Canton, Illinois. We started an IPSC-affiliated club. Dick Heine, the pistol smith, and several other friends, Marty Brown, Terry Creamer, we got that all going. And we were the first IPSC club east of the Mississippi. So I've been in this game for a while. My .45 use in the Army was very limited. I was infantry, and until infantry gets up to staff sergeant or higher, they're generally not going to have a sidearm. But a couple times I was issued a 1911, and a couple of days on the range, company picnics and things, we were able to do impromptu shooting sessions. So I handled some military 1911s at the time, and they were extremely reliable. They were really loose. You could rattle them and shake them, but they worked. And if you knew what you were about, they were plenty accurate for what you needed. But while I was in the Army, I had a personal .45, which was a Colt Gold Cup that Heine and I had worked over to basically just added a heavier spring to use full power loads instead of the 185 wad cutter loads that the bullseye shooters used. And that was an incredibly reliable and incredibly accurate .45 pistol. At one company day, the range we were on was a 200-meter range, and the Army had put up large steel plates with range markers. So the white 200-meter plate had been hit by a 50 that someone thought was cute. That knocked the steel off, so instead of being up on the steel post, it was just leaning on the ground against that post. And had a first lieutenant there who fancied himself quite the pistol shooter. And so I brought out my Gold Cup and let him shoot a truly accurate pistol. And we ended up with a bet. He bet me $5 per hit for every time I could hit that 200-meter target marker with my Gold Cup. I had a 7-round magazine. And I walked the first 2 up into it at 200 meters, and then the last 5 in the magazine, I rang it every time. So I got $25 off the first lieutenant. He was not a happy camper. He just absolutely couldn't believe that a .45 could even go that far, let alone ring that plate with the authority that it had 200 meters downrange. So I know the capabilities of a .45, and it is nothing to be trifled with. So if you think I'm just a damn FUD .45 guy, guilty as charged. Most of us know the history of the .45 cartridge, front and back. Designed by John Browning, America, the world's probably greatest ever weapon designer. It was at the request of the Army, and I mentioned this in an earlier one, but the Thompson-Lagarde tests and their experience with the .38 revolvers in the Philippines, the Army said, our semi-auto pistol that we're going to design will be no less than .45 caliber. And we got to hit them a substantial blow. So the .45 was utilized in several of the prototypes that led up to the 1911, the 1905, the 1909, and the 1910. Well, and I believe there might have been a 1907 variation in there as well. I have to do my research on that. Eventually, it became the 1911. Now, when Browning designed the cartridge, he first specified a 200 grain round nose full metal jacket bullet at a muzzle velocity of about 900 feet per second. In looking at that, the Army said, okay, it's a .45, but we want more. And so they specified a 230 grain bullet. Velocity dropped because of the weight to about 830 feet per second. And that became the standard load for the 1911 to this day. I mentioned Supervel in talking about the .380 and the 9mm. I really think Supervel, in my recollection, was the first ammunition company that came out with jacketed hollow points in all of the defensive pistol calibers. And they went back to a 185 grain bullet to get more velocity. Now, the 185 grain bullet had been loaded for the .45 for years and years and years, still is to this day. But it was in the form of a jacketed semi-wad cutter shape bullet, and it was used for pistol matches. Bullseye shooting, one hand, 50 yards, Camp Perry. And I knew Gil Hebard, who ran Gil Hubbard Guns for a number of years. Gil was the senior champion at Camp Perry, I want to say like 10 or 11 years running. The man was like a human bench rest. He could shoot groups like that at 50 yards. That light wad cutter load, that 185 grain bullet loaded to about 770 feet per second, that was really the only other 45 load available at the time. And being a little crazy anyway, when I first started reloading for the 45s for that Gold Cup I had, you could buy those 185 semi-wad cutters from Winchester as components, and if you put a good healthy charge of unique powder under it, you can move it from 770 feet per second up to about 1100, which, even though it's not a hollow point, that blunt form of that wad cutter, I wouldn't want to get in front of one at 1100 feet per second. I think it would thump you pretty hard. But Supervel brought out the jacketed hollow points, and now we have all kinds of jacketed hollow points for the 45, ranging from 185, maybe in a little bit less, up to 230 grains. If you look into some of the outdoorsman loads, looking at the 45 as bear defense, some of those using hard cast bullets go up to about 250 or 255 grains. So there's a lot of variety in what you can get in 45 ACP ammo out there now. Now, as time went on, we saw loads for the 45 jacked up to plus P pressures. Sure, the 45 is a light pressure load compared to the 9mm anyway. It always has been, and part of that is simply the diameter of the breech face. If it's 21,000 pounds per square inch, this is more square inches than a 9mm, so that's still more pounds of thrust working the action. There are variations of the 45 ACP now. One's called a 45 Super, which uses a strengthened case. I mentioned how 38 Super cases can blow out over the feed ramp. You can load 45s so hot that they will also, even though it's a much stronger case than the 38 Super ever was. But the 45 Super is a stronger case, but most 45 pistols with a recoil spring change, go to a couple, 3 pounds heavier spring, they can handle that 45 Super, and it's quite a bit hotter. And then beyond that is the 460 Roland, which is a slightly longer cartridge case to make sure they won't chamber in a 45. And the 460 Roland, with the pressures it develops, you're looking at 44 Magnum level performance from a 5-inch 1911. I'm not sure you need that much horsepower from a 1911, even if you're looking at it for bear defense, because to my notion, bear defense with a 45, a Super or a Roland or a 10mm is more the job of precision. And I have one of my earliest videos was on bear defense handguns. It's my #1 video. It still logs 2,000 or 3,000 views a day. And I don't think you need the raw power. You need the right kind of bullet that's going to not deform, going to penetrate deep, and allow you to use the precision needed to hit a grizzly in the right spot. So the 45 is very versatile. It's loaded as hot as you want to go, and there are a number of different hollow points out there. This is an XTP load, a Hornady bullet that's one of the tougher hollow points, and this is a standard velocity 45 load. Here is an all copper bullet by Barnes, and the all copper hollow points give good performance. This is one loaded by Black Hills Ammunition. This is a 45 plus P. And as I've mentioned with the other calibers, the fluid transfer monolithic bullets, these fluted all copper designs from Lehigh Defense, I think may be the wave of the future. They penetrate like a full metal jacket, so they're very reliable that way. But because of those flutes and the way the fluid is jetted out of those at very high velocities, I think they do as much damage as a hollow point, but they penetrate like a full metal jacket. They're very light bullets. They're generally loaded at very high velocities. This is a 135 grain load at over 1,300 feet per second. This is a Black Hills Honey Badger. And I kind of think these are the wave of the future. I mentioned the Police Marksman Stopping Power Study that I ran for the magazine. It was published in 1993. 241 reports from officers involved in shootings. The categories that we reported on were 38 Special, 9mm, 357 Magnum, and 45 ACP. The 45 scored a 54.5% success rate, just edging out the 357 at 53.8%. Interestingly, when we looked at individual loads, the single best performing load in terms of stopping power was a 38 Special plus P 158 grain lead semi-wad cutter hollow point load, and I will talk about that extensively when we get to the 38. It had the best performance of any single load at 77.7%, so almost 50% better than the generic 45 and generic 357 performance. It's an extremely well-balanced load that expands well, penetrates well. It's also easy to shoot, and I think that a hit in the middle with a small caliber is better than a hit out on the edge with a big caliber. So I really think that 38 probably logged a lot of good hits, and that accounted for a lot of its success. So it's not just caliber, it's performance, it's how you deliver that power on target. When we looked at the number of shots fired per incident, 45 averaged 2.7 shots per incident. The 9mm was more than double that at 5.5 shots per incident. The 9mm was the only caliber where high-capacity magazines were commonly in use on the street. So the 45s were pretty much all single-stack pistols. So, the question is, did the 45 shoot half as many rounds because it worked better? You needed twice as many 9mm to do the job of a single 45? Is that what it's telling us? Or did they simply shoot more 9mm because they had more 9mm? If you give a cop more ammo, chances are they're going to shoot it. There's not enough data that we could pick apart to tell which side of that equation was the correct one, but we'll never have that answer. But I thought it was very interesting. Half the rounds fired, and all of these shootings were reported by officers who had been in the incident. Therefore, they lived, they won. There's a lot of data out there on officers who did not win their fights. Greg Ellifritz has kept a large tally of handgun performance, very similar to what we did at Police Marksman. So there's a lot of different ways to look at this. The best performance we saw in that study for the number of rounds fired per incident was actually the 357, which was an average of 2.3 rounds per incident. 40 was just coming on the market at that time. We did not have any reports using that. Now, since that research project, we've seen the 40 come and explode on the market. At one point, it was probably tied with the 9mm, maybe ahead of the 9mm for law enforcement use. I think that's throttling back. The FBI in particular left the 40, went to the 9mm. We've seen the 357 SIG come on the market, the 45 gap. If you like a 40 and a 9mm size pistol, Glock says, gee, well, we can give you a 45 and a 9mm size pistol. And interestingly, that 45 gap had some major agencies, a couple agencies around the country bought into it. I'm not sure if they still use it. And both the 45 gap and the 357 SIG, the reason most agencies have moved away from them now is simply the cost of ammo. There is so little ammunition loaded in those calibers. The prices are astronomical, even for full metal jacket training ammunition. But several of my videos, if I failed to mention the 357 SIG, then I got scolded in the comments. So if you're a SIG lover out there, you are dedicated to your cartridge. And believe me, as we go, I will get to the 357 SIG. I'm going to lump it in with the 38 Super, which is almost identical. But the hot 9mm, I think, are an overlooked but very viable self-defense cartridge. 357 SIG did gain a number of agencies. When the air marshals were stood up after 9/11, they used 357 SIG. A couple of local agencies where I worked had 357 SIGs, but in my experience, the reason they got them is because SIG was trading them for whatever they had, and they were practically giving the pistols away to try to get the 357 SIG popularity up and going. And most of the agencies I knew that jumped on that bandwagon and got new pistols pretty inexpensively gave up on them because the ammo was just way too expensive. Okay, in terms of pistols for the 45, a couple from my collection. I showed you the Commander, lightweight Commander is absolutely my favorite 1911 variation of all. It's just a little bit smaller than the 5-inch. It's quite a bit lighter than the 5-inch, but still packs all the power. This is a 5-inch 1911 all steel frame, unloaded. This is a Rock River Arms that a friend of mine had custom built for him when he found out it was going to take 7 years to get one built by Dick Heine. And this is probably one of the most accurate 45s I've ever used. It's a phenomenal 5-inch pistol. These are pretty big and heavy for concealed carry use. They're great for field use in both 45 and 10 if you're going into bear country or something like that, going hog hunting with them. The 5-inch steel gun is the top of the size and weight. Here's one that when this hit the market, it was very popular, very difficult to get for several years. And this is the Springfield Armory XDS. It's a 3.3-inch barrel. It's unloaded. The full-size 1911s can carry 8 in the magazine plus 1 in the chamber with the good new 8-round magazines. This is like a revolver. This is a 5-shot magazine, 1 in the chamber. You got 6 rounds. And it is surprisingly comfortable to shoot with 45 loads. Now, I had this when I had to have carpal tunnel surgery done on the right hand. And I will tell you, for about 6 or 8 months, this didn't get shot very much. That was more than my healing wrist wanted. But now I'm back in there, and this shoots really well. If you've noticed, almost all of my semi-auto pistols have Richard Heine sights. Heine Specialty Products, Quincy, Illinois. He's a good friend, but I am not biased in this. I think he has the absolutely most high-quality aftermarket sights you can get your hands on. Most of the new ones are of this ledge design. So they have something very solid that you can hook on a belt. You can rack the slide with one hand. His night sights use what he calls a straight 8 pattern. Instead of 3 dots, they have a dot on the front and a single dot centered under the rear notch. And they are different diameters so that you can clearly see one from the other. Excellent. Now, like a lot of small pistols nowadays, comes with a 5-round magazine, but you got a 7-rounder that can be added in very quickly. That gives you even more gripping surface for people with really large hands, or at the very least, I can have 6 rounds in it and very quickly exchange for a 7-round reload, up my capacity. Now, the XDS is a traditional polymer striker-fired gun. It's surprisingly accurate, and to me it's really comfortable to shoot. They also make it 9mm if the recoil bothers you. Something I may not have mentioned in the 9mm 380. One thing we need to take into account when we talk about defensive handgun calibers and stopping power, there is no defensive pistol caliber that can approach the stopping power potential of a long gun. Any of these pistols, 45s, 10, 9mm 380s, are very feeble compared to a 5.56 carbine or a 7.62 carbine. That's stopping power. Very few people take a hit from a 5.56 fired by a law enforcement officer in this country and stay on their feet. And in most cases, the rounds the officers are shooting are state bid. In other words, low bid ammo. These are not loads that are developed for shooting people. They're really loads that were developed for shooting varmints. So they're rather shallow penetrators. The bullets a lot of times fragment very badly. But they do the job. So a handgun is always going to be a poor second to a long gun when we're talking about self-defense. People ask, well, gee, what about the pistol caliber carbines? What about a 9mm carbine, a Kel-Tec, or Smith & Wesson has one out now. Ruger has one. Some of them can be had in 40. There are some out there that it used to be, at least, that you could get in 45. And you can get AR-style carbines in 45 and even 10mm. What about them? Don't they add a lot of power? No, actually they don't. The 9mm, the 40, and the 45 don't gain a lot of velocity out of a 16-inch barrel as opposed to a 3 to 5-inch barrel. The loads are optimized for pistol-length barrels. So in some cases, the pushing power of that powder has burned out in 8 or 10 inches of that carbine barrel length, and some of them will actually deliver less velocity from a 16-inch gun than they do from a handgun. Most will gain some speed, maybe 100 feet per second or more. That's not a lot of difference. Now, if you're talking about a pistol caliber carbine in the magnum calibers, and I would lump the 10 millimeter in with that. So if you've got a 10 millimeter or a 357 carbine or a 44 carbine, often as a lever action, they gain an amazing amount of power. My 357 Magnum Browning lever action, house gun I call it, I shoot 125 grain loads, and they will go from 1,400 feet per second from a 4-inch revolver barrel. They will now launch at over 2,100 feet per second, over that magic 2,000 mark. 50% more velocity than they do from a handgun. And that turns those Magnum pistol calibers into rifles, beasts almost. So any handgun caliber is feeble compared to a long gun. Then when we look at 45 to 9 millimeter to 380 to the SIG to the 40 to the 10 millimeter, we're kind of splitting hairs, but to me it's physics. The more bullet you throw, the more velocity you throw it with, the harder it's going to hit. And if that bullet performs well in terms of expansion and penetration, I can't help but think that the larger calibers are going to hit harder and perhaps do a better job in stopping. Okay, I called the 380 marginal. I called the 9mm adequate. The one-word label I will apply to the 45 ACP is reliable. This is going to give the performance no matter the bullet weight, no matter the barrel length. You're throwing a heck of a chunk of lead. You're throwing in an adequate velocity. And especially if you're dealing with intervening cover like the windshield of a car, the 45 is reliable. Note, I did not call it legendary, which I mentioned at the beginning of this. I think some of the legendary stopping power of the 45 is legendary. Jeff Cooper, when I attended Classic Gun Sight, he claimed the 45 230 full metal jacket in military use would stop 19 times out of 20 with one hit on a person. That's 95% reliability. He's saying 95% of the time one hit with a 45 would put somebody down. That's not what we're finding when we look at real world percentages. I got around 55% when I looked at the 45, but it was the best of the calibers. The 357 was second in line. And those of you that know back to when cops were carrying 357s, especially the 125 grain jacketed hollow point load from a 4-inch 357, had a very reliable performance record of knocking people down. So I put the 45 in that same category. It is not legendary, but it is reliable. So what label do you think I'm going to apply to the 40 Smith & Wesson? That's the next caliber on my list. Thanks for watching. Okay, we got them both here now. You ready? Bud got one. Ginger got one. Oh, she missed it. She usually gets them, doesn't she, Bud? Okay, girl, last one. You ready? You ready? Yeah! That's all there is till next time.